At our 20th anniversary dinner, my husband clinked his glass. "I want a divorce. I've met someone younger." He said it loudly enough for the entire restaurant to hear. I smiled and replied, "Couldn't have picked a better moment." I slipped off my ring, tucked it into my clutch, and calmly announced that I'd be hosting a freedom party the following week. His friend's laughter died instantly when I mentioned one small, crucial detail. "I'm glad you're here with me. Stay with my story until the end and write in the comments which city you're watching from so I can see how far my story travels." I should have realized something was off the moment Andre chose Ristorante Bellecourt for our anniversary. In 20 years of marriage, my husband had never picked an Italian place. He always complained that garlic gave him headaches and red wine made him sleepy. Yet there we were, bathed in warm golden light and surrounded by the rich smell of basil and oregano, at a table he'd specifically requested right in the middle of the dining room. The restaurant hummed with conversation and clinking glasses. Couples leaned toward each other over intimate tables, while families laughed around bigger ones. Everyone else seemed genuinely happy to be there. I smoothed my navy blue dress, the same one Andre used to praise when we were dating, and tried to ignore the knot of unease that had been tightening in my stomach all week. Andre had been different lately, distant. He'd started working late, always blaming new projects at the accounting firm. His phone, which used to lie forgotten on counters or the coffee table, now never left his hand. If it rang during dinner or while we watched TV, he would get up and step into another room to answer. When I questioned it, he brushed me off with a flick of his hand. "You're being paranoid, Sylvia," he'd say without looking me in the eye. "It's just work. I'm busy." But tonight was supposed to be about us, about celebrating 20 years together, about remembering why we fell in love when I was 25 and he was 32. I had even booked a table at the quiet French bistro we'd gone to on our first anniversary, but Andre had canceled the reservation without telling me. "I thought we'd try somewhere new," he'd said that morning, adjusting his tie in the bedroom mirror. "Somewhere with more atmosphere." The waiter brought our appetizers, bruschetta that Andre didn't touch, and a Caesar salad I was too anxious to eat. His leg bounced under the table in a jittery rhythm that made the silverware tremble. "Are you waiting for someone?" I asked, forcing my tone to stay light. He looked up sharply, his brown eyes, the same ones that once made my heart race, now cold and distant. "What makes you say that?" "You keep looking around the room and checking the time." Andre's mouth twisted into something that might technically qualify as a smile, but felt more like a grimace. "I guess I'm just excited about tonight." The word excited hung between us, heavy and strange. It didn't feel like the excitement of a romantic evening. It felt like the charged energy right before someone does something they've been planning for a long time. When our main dishes arrived, osso buco for him, chicken piccata for me, Andre suddenly sat up straighter. He grabbed his wine glass, a strong Chianti that had stained his lips a deep red, and pushed back his chair. The movement was so abrupt, several nearby diners turned to stare. "Ladies and gentlemen," he called out, his voice cutting through the noise of the room. Conversations slowly died as people realized someone was making an announcement. "I'd like to make a toast." My stomach twisted. Andre was not a man who liked attention. He was quiet, methodical, the type who blended into the background at parties. In all our years together, I could count on one hand the times he'd raised his voice, even at home. "To my wife, Sylvia," he went on, lifting his glass higher. The restaurant was completely silent now. Every eye was fixed on our table. Heat rushed to my face, embarrassment, confusion, dread. "We've been married for 20 wonderful years." The word wonderful dripped with so much sarcasm that my skin crawled. People around us began to sense something was wrong. The elderly couple at the next table exchanged anxious glances. "But tonight," Andre said, his voice growing louder, more confident, "I want a divorce." The words hit me like a punch. I actually gasped, my hand flying to my chest as if I could somehow grab hold of the air that had been knocked out of me. The restaurant turned into a tomb. No cutlery clinked, no glasses moved. "I've found someone younger," he declared, still holding his glass high like this was some triumphant speech. Someone who appreciates me, someone who doesn't spend her days organizing closets and whining about my work hours. I stared at him, my mind scrambling to catch up. This wasn't a bad dream. It was happening. My husband of 20 years was divorcing me in front of a room full of strangers, choosing the most humiliating way possible to discard me. But beneath the shock and pain, something else woke up inside me, sharp, clear, and unexpectedly strong. Instead of collapsing, instead of crying or pleading, I felt a strange calm settle over me. I picked up my own wine glass, my hand steady in spite of everything. Slowly, I rose to my feet and met Andre's gaze across the table. For the first time in months, I truly saw him. Not as the man I'd married, but as a stranger wearing his face. "Perfect timing," I said, my voice ringing out just as clearly as his. The restaurant stayed completely silent, everyone holding their breath, waiting to see what I would do. I lifted my left hand and, slowly and deliberately, slid off my wedding ring. The plain gold band Andre had placed on my finger 20 years ago, with trembling hands and eyes full of tears. That ring had survived every argument, every illness, every rough patch. It had never left my hand. I held it up so he could see it clearly, then let it drop into my wine glass. It hit the bottom with a soft, sharp clink. "I'll be hosting a Freedom Gala next week," I announced to the room, surprised at how strong my voice sounded. "Consider this your official invitation to celebrate my release from a marriage that's been dead far longer than I was willing to admit." Andre's smug smile faltered. This was not the reaction he'd scripted in his head. He'd been expecting tears, begging, maybe hysterics, anything but this cool, almost cheerful acceptance, and my immediate shift into planning my own celebration. A low murmur rippled through the restaurant. Someone, pretty sure it was a woman at the bar, actually started clapping. Color rushed into Andre's cheeks, but it wasn't the confident flush he'd worn a moment before. It was pure embarrassment. "You're making a scene, Sylvia," he hissed, finally sinking back into his chair. I smiled. Truly smiled, for the first time in months. "No, Andre," I said quietly. "You made the scene. I'm just giving it an ending." I picked up my purse, leaving my untouched chicken piccata on the table, and the ring still resting at the bottom of the dark red wine. Before I turned to go, I leaned down next to his ear, close enough that only he could hear me. "You have no idea what you've just set in motion," I whispered, my voice low but rock steady. "And when you find out, you're going to wish this conversation had stayed private." As I walked toward the exit, my heels clicking confidently across the tile, I heard Andre call after me. "What's that supposed to mean?" I didn't look back. I didn't need to. I knew that, for the first time that evening, my husband was genuinely afraid, because Andre had no idea about the documents hidden in my jewelry box. He didn't know about the phone calls I'd been making while he was working late, and he absolutely didn't know about the one secret I'd been keeping, the one that was about to change everything. But he would. Soon. The cool November air hit my face as I stepped outside, and for the first time in months, I felt like I could actually breathe. 20 years of marriage had just come to an end, but something new had begun, something Andre never anticipated, something that would teach him that humiliating me in public was the worst decision he'd ever made. The drive home from Bellacourt should have been agonizing. I should have been sobbing, shaking, pulling over to the side of the road to call my sister, my mother, anyone who might comfort me. Instead, my mind felt strangely sharp as I followed the familiar streets back to our house, the 2-story colonial we'd bought 15 years earlier when Andre was promoted to senior accountant. Our house. I had to remind myself of that. It was still legally ours, at least for the moment. His dramatic little performance at the restaurant didn't magically dissolve our marriage or erase 20 years of shared assets. But as I pulled into the driveway and saw the warm kitchen light glowing through the window, a realization twisted in my stomach. I'd seen this coming, for longer than I wanted to admit. The signs had been there, stacked one on top of another for months, maybe even years. I'd just been too comfortable, too trusting, or too scared to face them. It began around March, about 8 months earlier. Andre suddenly started working late 3 or 4 nights a week. When I tried to pack him a homemade dinner to take along, he pushed the container away with irritation. "The vending machines are fine, Sylvia," he muttered, eyes glued to his laptop. "I don't need you treating me like a kid." The comment hurt, but I made excuses for him. Tax season was always hard on him. He was stressed, overworked. He'd cool down, I told myself. He always had before. Then the phone calls started. At first, there were only 1 or 2 a week, calls he'd take in the garage or down in the basement. When I asked who it was, he always had an answer ready. "Client emergency," he'd say lightly. "You know how it is?" And I did know how it was. And that was exactly the problem. Andre had never taken client calls from home before. His firm prided itself on work-life balance. It was one of the things he'd raved about when he was hired, how much he loved being able to leave work at work. By June, the calls were daily, sometimes more than once a day. Andre would step away from dinner, from the TV, even from conversations with me, to answer these urgent calls that somehow couldn't wait until morning. His excuses got vaguer. "Work stuff?" he'd mumble, already walking out of the room. That's when I started paying attention. The calls never went on for hours, usually just 15 or 20 minutes, but something in his tone was different. His voice softened. He sounded livelier, more animated. Sometimes I even heard him laughing from whatever room he'd locked himself in. One evening in July, I was on the back deck watering the plants when I heard him through the open kitchen window. He was making dinner plans with someone, naming a restaurant I'd never heard of, arranging to meet next Tuesday after work. When he came outside, I kept my voice casual. "Work dinner tomorrow?" I asked. For a second he looked almost startled. Then he nodded quickly. "Yeah, with Bob from the Peterson account. You remember Bob?" I did remember Bob Peterson, and I also remembered that Bob was a 72-year-old grandfather who never stayed past 4 p.m., and as far as I knew had never suggested an after-hours dinner in his life. I didn't call Andre out on his story. Not then. The changes weren't just about the phone calls. Andre started paying more attention to how he looked. He went back to the gym after a 5-year break, saying he wanted to get back in shape. He bought new clothes, tailored dress shirts, pricey jeans, cologne in sleek black bottles that cost more than we usually spent on groceries in a week. "You look good," I told him one morning as he straightened his new tie in our bedroom mirror. He barely glanced at me. "Thanks," he said, but there was no warmth behind it. It was the kind of flat reply you give a stranger who compliments your shirt in an elevator. Our physical relationship shifted too, so slowly I almost didn't notice at first. Andre had never been overly affectionate, but he'd always been steady. We used to hold hands while watching TV, kiss goodbye in the mornings, make love every week or two with an easy, familiar rhythm. All of that faded. He began staying up later, claiming he wasn't tired. He'd come to bed long after I'd fallen asleep and wake before me, getting ready in the bathroom with the door partly closed, moving quietly so he wouldn't disturb me. Except I was already awake. I lay there listening to the water run, realizing I was sharing a bed with a man who felt more and more like a stranger. The worst part wasn't the distance itself. It was the way he looked at me when he thought I wasn't paying attention. Sometimes I'd catch him watching me with an expression I couldn't quite define. It wasn't anger. It wasn't even resentment. It was colder than that, calculating, as if he were measuring something, weighing possibilities. In August, I found a receipt in the pocket of his pants while I was doing laundry. Dinner for 2 at Romano's, an upscale steakhouse downtown. $137 for 2 filet mignons, a bottle of wine, and dessert. The date was a Tuesday, the same Tuesday he'd supposedly had that work dinner with Bob Peterson. I stood in the laundry room, the receipt trembling slightly between my fingers. There could be explanations, I told myself. Maybe Bob liked expensive restaurants. Maybe they'd been entertaining a client. Maybe Andre had simply forgotten to mention that someone else had joined them. But standing there, surrounded by hampers and detergent and half-folded towels, I knew. My husband was having an affair. The logical thing would have been to confront him right away, to demand the truth, to ask for honesty, to decide whether our marriage was something worth fighting for. Instead, I folded the receipt carefully and slipped it into my jewelry box, sliding it under the small velvet pouch that held my grandmother's pearls. I told myself I needed more information before I could make any decisions, that I had to be absolutely sure. But the truth is, I was scared. Scared of the conversation that would rewrite my entire life. Scared of hearing things I couldn't unhear. Scared that 20 years of my existence had been invested in a man who no longer wanted me. In the weeks that followed, I watched him more closely, but in a way that wouldn't look like watching. I noticed that Andre had stopped talking about his day over dinner. He used to complain about obnoxious clients or tell me stories about his coworkers that made us both laugh. Now he ate in near silence, checking his phone every so often and answering my questions with short, clipped replies. I noticed he'd suddenly taken over his own laundry, saying he wanted to help out more around the house, even though chores had never once interested him in the past, and the only clothes he ever washed separately were his best ones, the new shirts, the expensive jeans. I noticed he'd changed the password on our laptop. The same shared computer we'd both used for years to check email and pay bills now required a login I didn't know. When I asked about it, Andre said there had been some kind of security issue at work and that IT had advised everyone to change all their passwords. Better safe than sorry, he said, eyes fixed somewhere over my shoulder instead of on my face. September brought new developments. Andre announced he'd be working some Saturday mornings to help the firm catch up on a backlog of annual reviews. He'd leave the house around 8:30 and be back by 2, claiming he'd spent the morning buried in spreadsheets and tax files. One Saturday, I drove past his office. The parking lot was nearly empty, just a security guard's car and a maintenance van. No blue Honda, no Andre. I sat in my car across the street for almost an hour, staring at the building, wondering where my husband was really spending his Saturday mornings, wondering who he was with, wondering how long this had been going on. Part of me wanted to call him right then, to ask him exactly where he was and force the truth into the light. But the bigger part of me still wasn't ready. By October, I had to admit I was living with a man I didn't recognize. Andre had become a polite stranger who shared my address. We moved around each other in the house like uneasy roommates, speaking only when necessary, living parallel lives that barely touched. So I began building a life that didn't revolve around him. I joined a book club at the library, something I'd thought about for years but never actually done because Andre always made dismissive comments about my little novels. I started meeting old friends for lunch, women I hadn't seen in ages. They asked gentle questions about Andre, and when I gave vague, non-committal answers, they didn't look surprised. And through it all, I kept that receipt in my jewelry box, along with the other small pieces of evidence I'd started collecting almost without realizing it. A credit card statement with charges at restaurants I'd never heard of. There was also a dry cleaning receipt for a dress shirt that came back smelling like a perfume I didn't recognize, and a business card from a florist that slipped out of his wallet when he was paying for groceries. I wasn't exactly playing detective. I was just awake for the first time in a long time, noticing things I would have brushed off before, and every new detail only confirmed what I already knew, but still couldn't bring myself to say out loud, my marriage was over, and had been for longer than I wanted to calculate. Andre's big, dramatic scene at Ristorante Bellecourt hadn't been some impulsive decision. It was the final act of something he'd been rehearsing for months. Months of carefully setting the stage so he could humiliate me in public and walk away feeling righteous. But Andre had made one enormous mistake. He assumed I'd been as blind as I looked. He assumed I'd fall apart, completely crushed, dependent on his kindness for whatever scraps of dignity and financial security he decided to toss my way. He had no idea that while he'd been planning his grand exit, I'd been quietly preparing my own response. He didn't know about the letter hidden in my jewelry box, right beside that first receipt from Romano's. The letter that had arrived 6 months earlier and turned everything upside down, though I hadn't told a single soul about it. Not my sister, not my friends, and definitely not Andre. I didn't sleep at all the night after the restaurant. How could I? 20 years of marriage had just exploded in front of an audience. It would be neighborhood gossip for months, but it wasn't the embarrassment or the shock that kept me awake. It was the realization that I could no longer avoid the truth I'd been dodging for 8 months. I needed to know who she was. The woman he'd chosen over 2 decades of marriage. The woman who was apparently worth publicly throwing me away. Andre never came home. I heard his car pull into the driveway around midnight, and 20 minutes later, I heard it start again and drive off. He'd probably come by to grab a bag. I realized he must have been arranging all this for weeks. Maybe he already had an apartment waiting. That thought should have gutted me. Instead, it just felt confirming. I spent the long hours before dawn at our kitchen table, a mug of coffee growing cold between my hands, staring at the small stack of evidence I'd finally taken out of my jewelry box, the receipt from Romano's, the dry cleaning slip with the strange perfume, the business card from Petals and Stems florist, and at the very bottom the letter that had changed everything 6 months earlier, the one I'd kept secret from everyone. But before I could deal with that, I needed answers about Andre's mystery woman, the woman he thought was worth all of this. By 7 a.m., I'd made up my mind. I got dressed with intention, not in my usual comfortable clothes, but in my black pantsuit, the one I saved for important occasions. If I was going to face my husband's lies, I wanted to do it looking like the strong woman I'd forgotten I was. Andre's office was in a sleek glass tower downtown, the kind of building that caught the morning sun and made everything else look washed out. I'd been there countless times over the years. Christmas parties, company picnics, the occasional lunch when I happened to be nearby. I knew the place. I knew which elevator went to the accounting firm on the 14th floor. I knew Andre's routine too. He always arrived by 8:15 and spent the first half hour of his day going over client files with a cup of coffee. He was a creature of habit. Once that had been comforting. Now it was an advantage. I waited in the parking garage until I saw his blue Honda pull into its usual spot. I watched him step out with his briefcase and the coffee mug I'd given him 2 Christmases ago, the one that said "World's Best Husband" in cheerful letters. The irony wasn't lost on me. I gave him 15 minutes to settle in, then took the elevator up to the 14th floor. The receptionist, a young woman named Jessica, who'd always been kind to me at company events, looked pleasantly surprised. "Mrs. Patterson, it's so nice to see you. Are you here to surprise Andre?" Hearing my married name hit harder than I expected, but I kept my face composed. Actually, I was hoping to talk to him about something important. Is he free? "Let me check," Jessica said, reaching for the phone. I raised a hand quickly. "Don't call ahead," I said. "I really do want it to be a surprise." She smiled and nodded toward the hallway. "He's in his usual office. You know the way." I did. I'd walked that hallway many times, usually carrying takeout or a homemade lunch, happy just to see him in his element. This time the walk felt different. Every step felt heavier, more final. His office door was slightly ajar, and I heard his voice inside, low and gentle. I hadn't meant to listen, but my feet froze on their own. "I know it was hard to watch," he was saying, his tone softer than I'd heard it in months. "But it's done now. She knows, and we don't have to hide anymore." My heart started pounding so hard I was sure he'd hear it from his desk. "I love you too," Andre added. "I should have done this years ago. We both know that." There was a pause, and then he laughed. The warm, easy laugh I remembered from when we were first dating, the one I hadn't heard directed at me in a very long time. "Of course I'm sure," he said. "Sylvia and we've been over for a long time. Last night only made it official. You're the one I want to be with," he'd said. "You're the one I should have chosen from the start." I stood frozen in the hallway, listening to my husband pour his heart out to another woman less than 12 hours after publicly divorcing me. The pain was sharp, almost blinding, but under it was something else. Relief, maybe, or the grim satisfaction of knowing my instincts had been right all along. "I have to go," Andre said. "I've got a meeting in 10 minutes, but I'll call you later, okay? Maybe we can celebrate properly tonight." I heard the soft click as he hung up, then the creak of his chair as he leaned back. This was my moment. I could turn around and leave, pretend I hadn't heard any of it, and let the lawyers handle everything like civilized adults. Or I could open that door and demand the truth to my face. I pushed the door open. Andre looked up from his desk, his expression morphing from relaxed contentment to shock, and then to something that looked a lot like fear. "Sylvia," he said, half rising from his chair, "what are you doing here?" "I came to talk to my husband," I replied, stepping into the office and closing the door behind me, though I'm starting to wonder if I even know who that is anymore. He slowly sat back down, color rising in his cheeks. "If this is about last night, it's about a lot of things," I cut in, "including the phone call you just finished, the one where you told someone you loved her, the one where you said you should have chosen her from the beginning." His mouth opened, then closed again. For a moment we just stared at each other across his desk, the same desk he'd supposedly been working late at all those nights. "How long?" I asked quietly. "Sylvia, I don't think—" "How long, Andre?" He exhaled hard and dragged a hand through his hair. 2 years, he said at last. "Maybe a little more." 2 years. 2 years of lies. 2 years of pretending. 2 years of making me feel like I was crazy for noticing the distance between us. 2 years of letting me believe that I was the problem, that I wasn't trying hard enough, wasn't exciting enough, wasn't enough to keep my own husband's attention. "Who is she?" I asked. He hesitated, his gaze skittering away from mine. "Does it matter?" "It matters to me." Another long pause, and then, so softly, I almost missed it. "Miranda." The name hit like a punch to the gut. Miranda. My best friend. Miranda, the woman who'd been my maid of honor. The one who held my hand through my father's funeral 3 years ago. The woman I called, sobbing, when I first suspected Andre was cheating. Never imagining. "Miranda Walsh," I whispered. The way Andre flinched told me everything I needed to know. My legs suddenly went weak, and I dropped into the chair across from his desk. Miranda. Sweet, perpetually single Miranda who claimed she envied my marriage. Miranda, who'd come over for dinner every few weeks. Miranda, who helped me plan Andre's surprise 40th birthday party last year. Miranda, who listened so sympathetically when I told her I was afraid my marriage was falling apart. She was supposed to be my friend, I murmured, more to myself than to him. "She is your friend," Andre said quickly, defensive. "She never wanted this to happen. Neither of us did. It just happened." I stared at the man I'd slept beside for 20 years and realized I didn't recognize him at all. "It just happened," I repeated. "For 2 years, you both just accidentally fell into each other's beds every Tuesday during your so-called work dinners?" He had the decency to look ashamed. "At least at first it was innocent," he said. "She was having a hard time with her job, and we were having problems, you and I. We were just talking as friends, and then, I finished for him. You decided to have an affair instead of talking to your wife about our problems?" "You wouldn't have listened," he snapped, his voice rising. "You never listen, Sylvia. You're so wrapped up in your routines, your book clubs, your perfectly organized little life, you didn't even notice I was drowning." The accusation stung, partly because there was a sliver of truth in it. I had been comfortable in our routine, maybe too comfortable, but that didn't come close to excusing what he had done. "So you talked to Miranda instead," I said flatly. "At first, yes, just as friends, but she understood me in a way that—" He swallowed. "In a way you haven't in a long time." I rose to my feet slowly, my fingers tightening around the strap of my purse. "Where?" He blinked. "What? Where do you meet her, Andre? Because I know it's not at work dinners with Bob Peterson." He stared down at his desk. "She has an apartment downtown near the River District." Of course she did. Miranda had moved 6 months ago, saying she wanted to be closer to her job. She'd invited me over several times to see the new place, but something always came up. My errands, appointments, Andre needing something. Now I could see those conflicts for what they were. She'd never really wanted me there, not in the apartment where my husband was probably spending half his life. "The flowers," I said, remembering the florist's card. "You buy her flowers?" Andre nodded miserably. "How often?" "Sylvia, I don't see how— How often do you buy my best friend flowers, Andre?" "Every Friday," he whispered, "for the past year. Every Friday, while I was at home making dinner for the husband who was planning to leave me for my best friend, while I did his laundry, paid his bills, and kept our life neatly stitched together. He was bringing another woman flowers once a week." I turned toward the door, then paused. "Last night," I said, still facing away. "The restaurant. You chose it because you knew she'd be watching, didn't you?" Silence. "You wanted her to see you humiliate me. You wanted to put on a show, make it clear to everyone that you were choosing her over me, that I was the pathetic wife being tossed aside for someone better." "Sylvia." I turned back to him one last time. "You made one mistake, Andre," I said quietly. "You assumed I'd be destroyed by this. You assumed I'd be left with nothing." I could see the confusion in his eyes, and underneath it, a flicker of worry. "But you don't know everything about me," I went on. "You stopped paying attention to your wife a long time ago, and that's going to cost you more than you realize." I left him sitting at his desk, probably already reaching for his phone the second I disappeared down the hallway. I could almost picture it. Him calling Miranda, panicking, trying to dissect what I might know. Let him wonder. Let him stew. Because while he'd been carefully staging his grand exit, playing house with my former best friend and buying her flowers every Friday with money from our joint account, I'd been dealing with something he didn't have the faintest clue about, something that was about to change everything. The drive home from Andre's office passed in a hazy blur of red lights and familiar streets that suddenly felt strange. Miranda. My best friend. Miranda. 3 weeks earlier, she'd been sitting at my kitchen table, coffee in hand, listening to me cry about my failing marriage, offering tissues and sympathy while she was sleeping with my husband. I pulled into the driveway and stayed in the car for several minutes, my hands locked around the steering wheel, letting reality rearrange itself in my mind. 20 years married to a man who had been lying to me. 15 years of friendship that had quietly rotted from the inside for the last 2. I should have been completely shattered, and part of me was. But there was something else, too, something that had been waiting quietly in my jewelry box for 6 months, tucked under my grandmother's pearls and that first receipt from Romano's. Something Andre and Miranda knew nothing about. Something that was about to flip the balance of power in a way they never could have predicted. Inside the house, I went straight to my bedroom. My hands were steadier than I expected as I opened my jewelry box. There it was, right where I'd left it. A cream-colored envelope with the return address of Hartwell, Morrison & Associates, attorneys at law. The letter that had arrived on a Tuesday morning in June, while Andre was handling a client emergency at work. I'd almost thrown it away at first, assuming it was some marketing letter or scam. Law firms didn't generally reach out to homemakers out of nowhere, and I'd never heard of Hartwell, Morrison & Associates. But the heavy paper, the quality of the envelope, and the formal way my name was typed on the front had made me curious enough to open it. Now I unfolded the letter again, even though I'd practically memorized it over the last 6 months. "Dear Mrs. Sylvia Patterson," it began, "we are writing to inform you that you have been named as the sole beneficiary in the estate of Eleanor Margaret Whitmore, deceased." Ms. Whitmore, my mother's younger sister, my Aunt Eleanor. She'd moved to Colorado when I was a child and rarely visited. I remembered sporadic Christmas cards and seeing her at my mother's funeral 12 years ago, but we'd never been close. Honestly, I'd almost forgotten about her existence. According to the letter, she had left her entire estate to me, real property, investments, and liquid assets totaling approximately $800,000. $800,000. When I first read that number, I'd had to sit down. The letter went on to explain that Aunt Eleanor had never married or had children and had built a comfortable fortune as a real estate investor. She'd apparently followed my life quietly from a distance and decided that I should inherit everything after she died of a stroke at 78. There was one more important detail. Ms. Whitmore had included instructions that the inheritance should remain confidential until I chose to disclose it. She believed sudden wealth could complicate family dynamics and wanted me to have time to adjust privately before telling anyone. Aunt Eleanor had been smarter than anyone realized. If I'd announced the inheritance in June, Andre would have immediately considered it ours. In a divorce, he'd likely have tried to claim half or more. Instead, I said nothing. Something inside me whispered to wait, to keep this secret close until I truly understood what it meant for my future. Over the next few months, I met with Mr. Hartwell several times, always while Andre was at the office. I learned that the estate included not just cash, but 2 rental properties in Denver that generated steady monthly income. I had, without warning, inherited a level of financial independence I'd never imagined, enough security to not just survive without Andre's accountant salary, but to live comfortably. During those meetings, I also noticed something about Mr. Hartwell. He asked careful, pointed questions about my marriage, about Andre's role in our finances, about whether I felt safe and supported at home. At the time, I'd found his questions awkward, even intrusive. Now I understood. Aunt Eleanor must have anticipated that her niece might need an escape route. She'd given her lawyer instructions to make sure I knew I had options. The irony of it all was almost poetic. While Andre had been mapping out his escape, wooing another woman, and rehearsing the perfect public humiliation, I had been quietly sitting on enough money to disappear if I wanted to. While he assumed I would be left begging for whatever crumbs he decided to toss my way, I had been meeting with financial advisors, learning about portfolios, and planning my life without him. And the best part? Under Colorado law, inheritances received during marriage are classified as separate property, not marital assets, which meant that even if Andre tried to go after half of everything in the divorce, he had no legal claim to Aunt Eleanor's money. It was mine, fully and completely. I picked up my phone and dialed Mr. Hartwell's direct line. He answered on the second ring. "Mrs. Patterson," he said warmly, "how are you?" "I've been better," I admitted, "but I think it's time to make some changes." "I see. Does this have to do with your marriage situation?" He was referring to the last time we'd met, when I'd vaguely mentioned that Andre and I were having some difficulties without really explaining. "My husband asked me for a divorce last night," I said. "Very publicly, very humiliatingly." There was a pause on the line. "I'm sorry to hear that," Mr. Hartwell replied, "but I can't say I'm entirely surprised. Eleanor suspected something like this might happen eventually." "What do you mean?" "She left additional instructions in her will, instructions I wasn't supposed to share unless you found yourself in exactly this situation." I heard papers shuffling. She wrote, "If my niece's marriage ends, she should know that she has more power than she realizes. Help her use it wisely." More power than I realized. For the first time since leaving Andre's office, I smiled. "Mr. Hartwell," I said, "I need to know exactly what my options are, and I need to know them today." We spent the next hour on the phone while he laid out the full picture of my financial position. The $800,000 was only the beginning. The Denver rental properties were worth another $300,000 combined and brought in about $4,000 a month. On top of that, Aunt Eleanor had built a careful portfolio of stocks and bonds that, managed properly, would likely keep growing. Just like that, I wasn't simply comfortable anymore. I was a quiet kind of millionaire. Not the flashy kind, but the kind who would never have to worry about money for the rest of her life. I was a woman who could hire the best divorce lawyer in the state without blinking, a woman who could walk away from a cheating husband and a lying best friend and land on her feet. But I wasn't quite ready to walk away. Not yet. "Mr. Hartwell," I said as we wrapped up, "I'd like you to prepare some documents for me." "What kind of documents?" "I want to file for divorce first, before Andre even has the chance." And I want to make sure he fully understands what he's thrown away by choosing to humiliate me instead of speaking to me like an adult." There was a note of approval in his voice. "I think Eleanor would be very proud of you, Mrs. Patterson. When would you like to begin?" "Immediately." After we hung up, I walked slowly through my house. The house Andre and I had shared for 15 years. The house he'd essentially abandoned for an apartment with my former best friend. I looked at the furniture we'd picked out together, the framed photos lining the walls, 20 years of history that, as it turned out, had been a lie for at least the last 2. I should have been shattered. I should have been sobbing, screaming, calling my sister, and collapsing under the weight of the betrayal. Instead, what I felt was something I hadn't truly experienced in years. Excitement. Not about the money, though that certainly changed the landscape. Excitement about what came next. About the life I could build without a husband who took me for granted and a best friend who had been quietly dismantling my trust. My phone buzzed. A text from Miranda. "Sylvia, honey, I heard about last night. I'm so sorry. Call me if you need anything. I'm here for you." I stared at the message for a long moment, then deleted it without replying. Let her worry. Let her spend the next few days pretending to be the supportive friend, all while sleeping with my soon-to-be ex-husband. She had no idea what was coming. Neither of them did. I went back to my jewelry box and took out one more item. Aunt Eleanor's ring. A simple band with a small sapphire that Mr. Hartwell had sent along with the letter. I'd never worn it, saving it for some special occasion that never seemed to arrive. I slipped it onto my right hand now, and the sapphire caught the afternoon light streaming through the bedroom window. It felt like a promise, or a reminder. I was not the helpless, discarded wife Andre thought he'd left behind. I was Eleanor Whitmore's niece. I was a woman with resources, choices, and, for the first time in years, a clear idea of what I wanted from my life. And what I wanted, more than anything, was to make sure Andre and Miranda fully understood what they'd thrown away when they chose betrayal and humiliation over honesty. The rules had just changed, and this time, I held all the cards. I had exactly 4 days to set my plan in motion before Andre started to wonder why I hadn't fallen apart. 4 days. That's how long I figured it would take before Andre and Miranda expected me to come crawling back, begging for their mercy and whatever generous financial crumbs they felt like tossing my way. They had no idea what was coming. Mr. Hartwell worked fast. By Thursday afternoon, the divorce petition was drafted, filed, and ready to be served. By Friday morning, I'd opened new bank accounts and moved my inheritance into accounts that had only my name on them. Andre had always handled our finances, convinced I was too scattered or uninterested to understand money. That particular miscalculation was about to hurt him more than he could imagine. I spent Friday afternoon at Petals and Stems, the florist whose business card I'd found in Andre's wallet. The owner, a middle-aged woman named Carol, recognized the situation immediately when I described the weekly orders. "Oh yes," she said with a sympathetic tilt of her head. "Your husband's been sending arrangements to his friend every Friday for about a year now. Always roses, always the expensive ones. Usually runs him about $75 to $80 each time." $75 to $80 every week for a year. Nearly $4,000 of our money spent on flowers for my best friend, while he lectured me about cutting back on the grocery budget. "I'd like to place an order," I told Carol, "for delivery today." "Of course," she said. "What would you like to send?" I smiled. 12 black roses, with a very specific note. Carol's eyebrows rose, but she wrote down every word without comment. I paid with my new credit card, the one tied to my inheritance account, and gave her Miranda's address, the same River District apartment Andre had reluctantly admitted to when I cornered him in his office. The note was short and precise. "For someone who collects other people's husbands, enjoy your prize. S." By 6 p.m., my phone wouldn't stop buzzing. First Andre, then Miranda, then Andre again. I let every call go to voicemail, then finally turned the phone off altogether. Let them panic. Let them spiral over what I knew and what I might be planning. I spent Friday night at home. My home, I reminded myself, since Andre had effectively abandoned it. I packed up everything that belonged to him, his clothes, his books, his precious vintage beer steins I'd always secretly hated. Each item went neatly into boxes, which I stacked by the front door like a hotel checkout waiting for pickup. When he came for his things, he wouldn't be stepping into our space anymore. He'd be collecting leftovers. Saturday morning brought unexpected guests. I was in the kitchen with my coffee when I heard a car in the driveway, followed by sharp, insistent knocking. Through the peephole, I saw Miranda on my porch, her usually perfect blonde hair slightly messy, her face flushed with anger. Behind her stood Andre, looking uncomfortable and vaguely guilty. For a moment, I considered not answering. Part of me wanted to let them stand there pounding on the door, a reminder that they no longer had any claim over my time. But curiosity won. I wanted to see how they'd try to twist this, how they'd spin themselves into the victims of their own betrayal. I opened the door just enough to keep the chain in place. "Sylvia!" Miranda burst out immediately, her voice pitched higher than normal. "We need to talk." "Do we?" I asked calmly. "Because I think everything's already been said. Andre made his feelings perfectly clear on Wednesday night, and you've made yours clear for the past 2 years. Miranda flinched. Andre stepped forward, his jaw clenched. "You sent her threatening flowers?" he said accusingly. "That's harassment, Sylvia. That's not like you." I almost laughed. "You're right, Andre. It's not like me. The old me would have hidden in this house crying, blaming myself for not being good enough to keep my husband faithful." I let that hang for a second. But the old me didn't know her husband was spending our money on flowers for her best friend every week for a year. Both of them actually looked ashamed, for a moment at least. "Let us in," Miranda said, trying to nudge the door. "We are not having this conversation on your front porch where the neighbors can hear." "Why not?" I asked. "You didn't seem too worried about an audience when Andre announced our divorce in front of 50 strangers at Ristorante Bellecourt." "That was different," Andre muttered weakly. "How?" He didn't have an answer. I studied them through the narrow gap in the doorway. They looked like people who'd finally been caught and were scrambling for a version of the story that made them look less cruel. Miranda's designer jeans and expensive handbag suddenly looked less like style and more like armor, props in the life she'd built on other people's husbands. "What do you want?" I asked at last. "We want to explain," Miranda said. "This isn't how we wanted you to find out." "Really?" I tilted my head. "How did you want me to find out? Were you going to tell me before or after my husband left me for my best friend?" Andre shifted uneasily. "Sylvia, you have to understand." "I have to understand what?" I cut in. "That you're both liars? That you're both perfectly capable of betraying someone who trusted you completely? Oh, I understand that very clearly now." "We never meant for it to happen this way," Miranda said, and I saw tears forming in her eyes. Real ones. Somehow that made me angrier than crocodile tears would have. "How did you mean for it to happen, Miranda?" I asked. "Did you have a timeline? A rollout plan for stealing my husband?" She opened her mouth, then closed it again. Andre put a protective hand on her shoulder. The small, familiar gesture, the way he touched her like she belonged to him, made something hot and sharp twist in my chest. "You know what?" I said, starting to close the door. "I actually don't care how you meant for it to happen. It happened. You chose each other over honesty, over friendship, over 20 years of marriage. Now you can live with that choice." "Wait," Andre blurted, wedging his foot in the doorway. "We need to talk about the practical stuff. The house, our accounts, the divorce settlement." There it was. The real reason they were on my porch. They weren't here for apologies or honesty. They were here for damage control. "Our accounts," I repeated slowly. "Our joint accounts," Andre clarified. "I know you're angry, but we need to be adults about dividing our assets fairly." I stared at him. "Adults?" I echoed. "You want us to be adults?" "Yes," he said. "Like the way adults communicate honestly with their spouses instead of lying for 2 years?" Color crept up his neck. That's not fair, Sylvia. Our marriage was over long before Miranda and I. Our marriage was over the moment you chose to lie to me instead of talking to me, I cut in. But you're right about one thing. We do need to handle this like adults. I reached into the small table by the door and pulled out a manila envelope, the one Mr. Hartwell had delivered the day before. Divorce papers, I said, sliding it through the crack. You've been served. Andre's face went pale as he took it. You already filed? Yesterday morning, I replied. I would have done it Wednesday night, but the courthouse was closed. But we haven't talked about terms, Miranda protested, glancing between Andre and the envelope. You can't just decide everything unilaterally. I smiled, and from the way they both shifted, I knew it unsettled them. Actually, Miranda, I can. When a marriage ends because one spouse has been unfaithful, the innocent spouse tends to get very favorable terms, especially when the cheater has been spending marital funds on their affair. Andre's grip tightened around the envelope. What are you talking about? $4,000 in flowers, Andre. Dinner receipts going back 18 months. Hotel charges on our credit card for nights you claim you were working late. My lawyer is very interested in all the evidence I've been collecting. Our lawyer? Miranda repeated weakly. My lawyer, I corrected. James Patterson, from Patterson, Wells and Associates. You might have heard of him. He handled the Morrison divorce last year. Mrs. Morrison walked away with 70% of their assets after proving her husband cheated. Andre stared down at the papers like they were written in another language. Sylvia, you can't be serious. We can work this out ourselves. We don't need expensive lawyers. What we needed, I said calmly, was honesty. We needed you to honor your vows. We needed about 1,000 conversations you never gave me. So, yes, now we need lawyers. I began to close the door again, but Miranda's voice rose sharply. Sylvia, please, I know you hate me right now, but we've been friends for 15 years. That has to count for something. I looked at her. This woman who'd sat in my kitchen, helped me throw parties, held my hand at my father's funeral, all while sleeping with my husband. You're right, I said at last. 15 years should count for something. It should have been enough to stop you from betraying me. But it wasn't. So now those 15 years count for exactly nothing. I closed the door and locked it, then went back to the kitchen where my coffee was getting cold. Through the window, I watched them on the porch, Andre flipping through the divorce papers, Miranda pacing and gesturing in agitation. My phone, which I'd turned back on that morning, started buzzing non-stop. Texts, calls, voicemails. I ignored every single one. There was nothing left to discuss. No negotiations left to have. They'd made their choices, and now they could deal with the fallout. What they didn't know yet, what they wouldn't discover until the divorce was already well underway, was that I no longer needed their money or their support. I didn't need to fight for half of Andre's modest accountant salary or for a share of our joint savings, which barely scraped $20,000. I had my own money now. More money than Andre would ever see in a lifetime of tax returns. And the best part? Not a cent of it was marital property. None of it could be divided. I was about to become a very wealthy single woman, and Andre was about to learn that the wife he'd taken for granted for 20 years was far more valuable than he had ever understood. But before that, I had one last surprise for them, one final move to make sure they truly felt what they'd thrown away when they chose betrayal over truth. The game was almost over, and I was holding the winning hand. The divorce moved much faster than Andre expected. Mr. Patterson, no relation to Andre, which felt like poetic justice, was everything Andre's overpriced attorney was not. Meticulous, relentless, and backed by a stack of evidence that made Andre's infidelity impossible to deny. The flower receipts alone told a brutal story. $75 to $80 every Friday for 52 weeks came out to nearly $4,000 of marital money spent on another woman. And that was only the start. Mr. Patterson had hired a private investigator, and what he uncovered filled an entire folder: hotel invoices, restaurant bills, even a weekend trip to Napa Valley that Andre had sworn was a work conference. Your client has spent approximately $18,000 of marital funds on his extramarital affair over the past 2 years, Mr. Patterson said calmly to Andre's attorney during our first settlement meeting. Mrs. Patterson is seeking full reimbursement of those funds, plus damages for emotional distress. Andre's lawyer, a nervous young man who kept fidgeting with his glasses, flipped through the documents, visibly rattled. My client disputes some of these charges, he said. Some of these dinners could have been legitimate business expenses at Romano's Steakhouse. Mr. Patterson arched an eyebrow. With a woman who doesn't work at his firm, on nights when his wife believed he was working late at the office? The room fell silent except for the faint sound of Andre shifting in his chair. Across the table, he looked smaller than I'd ever seen him. Gone was the swaggering man who'd announced our divorce in the middle of a crowded restaurant. In his place sat someone slowly realizing that his perfectly staged exit wasn't going to be clean or cheap. Furthermore, Mr. Patterson went on, Mrs. Patterson is seeking spousal support in the amount of $3,000 per month for the next 5 years, given that she set aside her own career prospects to support her husband over the course of their 20-year marriage. Andre's lawyer almost dropped his pen. $3,000? My client only earns $60,000 a year before taxes. That's completely unreasonable. I watched Andre's face as those numbers sank in. $3,000 a month would leave him with barely enough to cover his own basic bills, especially if he intended to keep an apartment with Miranda. The comfortable little future he'd imagined with his new beginning was evaporating right in front of him. Perhaps your client should have considered the financial implications before engaging in a 2-year affair, Mr. Patterson replied smoothly. Adultery has consequences, gentlemen. The meeting dragged on for 3 hours. By the end of it, Andre looked like he'd aged a decade. His lawyer mumbled something about reviewing our demands and getting back to us within a week, but everyone in the room knew they didn't have much room to negotiate. The evidence was overwhelming, and Colorado law isn't particularly generous to cheating spouses. As we gathered our files, Andre caught my eye. Sylvia, he said quietly, can we talk for a minute? Just us? Mr. Patterson began to object, but I lifted a hand. 5 minutes, I said. That's all. When the lawyers stepped out, Andre slumped in his chair like all the air had gone out of him. This isn't what I wanted, he muttered, staring at the table. I never wanted to hurt you financially. I studied his face, searching for any trace of the man I'd fallen in love with 25 years ago. What did you want, Andre? I wanted to be happy, he said. I wanted to be with someone who made me feel alive again. And you couldn't tell your wife you felt dead in your own marriage? He finally looked up. Would you have listened? The question caught me off guard, because maybe, in some ways, he had a point. Had I settled too deeply into our routines? Had I stopped seeing him as a person with his own unmet needs? Had I been so focused on keeping our life tidy and peaceful that I'd missed the fact that he felt trapped in it? I don't know, I admitted. But we'll never know now, will we? Because you chose to lie instead of even trying to talk to me. Andre rubbed his temples. $3,000 a month, Sylvia. That will ruin me. You ruined our marriage, I replied. You shattered 20 years of trust. You blew up my friendship with Miranda. So yes, Andre, there are consequences. Can't we work something out? He asked. Something more reasonable? I stood and picked up my purse. Mr. Patterson will be in touch with your attorney. Sylvia, wait. Andre scrambled to his feet, panic edging his voice. I know you hate me right now, but you don't really want to see me homeless, do you? You don't want to destroy my whole life over this. I stopped at the door, my hand on the handle. A small part of me remembered the man who'd once loved me, the one who'd held my hand at my mother's funeral, who'd stayed home to care for me when I was sick. But that part was drowned out by other memories, his smug expression at Bellacourt, the years of lies, the weekly flowers from my best friend while I cooked dinner, believing we still had a marriage, Miranda's tears on my porch, not of remorse but of annoyance at being exposed. You're not homeless, Andre, I said finally. You have Miranda. You chose her, remember? Now you get to live with that choice. The divorce was finalized 6 weeks later. Andre accepted all of our terms rather than risk a long, expensive court battle he couldn't afford to fight or win. I ended up with the house, 3/4 of our joint assets, and yes, $3,000 a month in spousal support for 5 years. What Andre never found out, and what the lawyers never needed to know, was that I didn't actually need his money. Every month, when that spousal support hit my account, I sent the full amount straight to the local women's shelter. The money he was struggling to scrape together for me went to women who truly needed it, women escaping marriages far worse than mine. The irony was beautiful. Andre was working overtime and living in a cramped studio so he could fund new beginnings for women he'd never even meet. As for Miranda, I heard about her through mutual acquaintances. Reality, it seemed, was a lot less glamorous than stolen dinners and hotel rooms. Being the other woman, with weekly roses and fancy restaurants, was one thing. Living with a divorced man who could barely pay rent was another. She ended up leaving her downtown apartment, the one Andre could no longer help her afford, and moved in with a roommate for the first time since college. I found all this out from Sarah, a woman from my book club who ran into Miranda at the grocery store. Sarah had always been more of a friendly acquaintance than a real friend, but after the divorce, she became one of my strongest allies. "She asked about you," Sarah told me over coffee at our favorite cafe. "She wanted to know how you were doing, if you were dating, if you seemed happy." "And what did you tell her?" I asked. Sarah gave me a wicked little smile. "I told her you look absolutely radiant. Which you do, by the way. I've never seen you happier." And she was right. 6 months after the divorce was finalized, I felt better than I had in years. I'd started traveling, something Andre always insisted we couldn't afford. I took a photography class and discovered I had a talent for landscapes. I joined a hiking group and was in better shape at 65 than I'd been at 40. I'd even started dating again. Nothing serious, just coffee, dinners, long conversations with men I met through my new hobbies. Men who didn't know about my inheritance. Men who liked me for my wit, my stories, my company, not my bank balance. Meanwhile, the money from Aunt Eleanor stayed mostly untouched in carefully managed investments, growing quietly under Mr. Hartwell's watchful eye. I lived comfortably off the rental income from the Denver properties, $4,000 a month that paid for everything I needed, and then some. I'd never lived so well with so little financial anxiety, but the best part of my new life wasn't the money, it was the freedom. I woke up each morning in a house that belonged entirely to me. Every picture on the wall, every piece of furniture, every color on every surface was there because I chose it. I planned my days without needing to check anyone else's schedule. I ate what I wanted, when I wanted. I watched what I liked on TV. I went to bed when I was tired. Not when someone else decided it was time. I was alone. But I wasn't lonely. For the first time in decades, I felt fully like myself. A year after the divorce, I ran into Andre at the grocery store. He looked diminished, tired, older. His once meticulous grooming was fraying around the edges. His cart was filled with generic brand everything, and his expression had the pinched look of someone constantly doing mental math. "Sylvia?" he said when he saw me in the produce aisle, his voice carrying a note of surprise, and maybe nerves. "Andre." I kept my tone polite, neutral. We were strangers now, two people who used to share a life and now simply shared a history. "You look," he began, then faltered, searching for the words. "You look really good." I was wearing a new dress I'd bought for a photography exhibit opening. My hair was cut shorter, styled in a way that suited me better than it ever had during our marriage. I felt confident, alive. "Thank you," I replied. There was an awkward pause as shoppers pushed their carts around us. "How are you managing?" he asked finally. "I mean, financially? I know the spousal support isn't much, and with the economy..." I almost laughed. In his mind, I was still the abandoned wife scraping by, terrified of bills and grateful for every check he sent. He had no idea I'd just come back from a 2-week trip to Italy. No idea I was seriously considering buying a small cabin in the mountains. "I'm doing well," I said. "Very well, actually." Something in my tone seemed to confuse him. He frowned faintly. That's good. I'm glad to hear that. Another silence settled between us. Then, because I was genuinely curious, I asked, "How are you and Miranda?" His expression dimmed. "We're working things out," he said. "It's been an adjustment." An adjustment. That was one way to describe discovering that the thrilling affair you risked everything for isn't quite as magical when it turns into shared bills, laundry, and everyday life in a cramped apartment. "I hope you're both happy," I said, and to my own surprise, I meant it. Not because I wished them a fairy tale ending, but because whether they were happy or miserable had nothing to do with me anymore. "Sylvia," Andre added as I started to leave, "I just want you to know. I'm sorry. For everything. For how I handled it. For how it all happened." I stopped and looked at him. Really looked at him. This was the man who'd once known every detail of my life. The man who'd seen me at my worst, my sickest, my most vulnerable. The man who'd chosen someone else instead of choosing honesty. "I know," I said quietly. "But Andre, you're apologizing to the wrong person." He blinked. "What do you mean?" "You should apologize to yourself," I said. "You're the one who lost the most." I left him standing there, frowning slightly, probably turning that over in his mind. But I knew exactly what I meant. He hadn't just lost a wife. He'd lost a partner who would have stood beside him through anything, if he'd been honest. He'd lost someone who would have gone to counseling, rebuilt trust, done the hard work. If he'd been brave enough to admit he was unhappy, he'd thrown away 20 years of real love and real history for a relationship built on secrecy and deception, and relationships that start with betrayal rarely end with loyalty. Someday, whether in a year or in 5, Miranda will leave. The thrill will fade, the resentment will grow, and when that day comes, Andre will be left alone, with nothing but the realization of what he traded away for something that was never meant to last. But that's his road to walk, his lesson to learn. I walked out into the late afternoon sunlight and headed to my car, my bags full of ingredients for the dinner party I was hosting that weekend. 8 new friends were coming over. We'd eat the food I chose, drink the wine I picked, laugh in the home I'd created entirely for myself. 26 months earlier, I'd been a wife who had slowly disappeared inside someone else's life. Tonight, I was a woman who had found herself again, stronger, happier, and more independent than I ever imagined I could be. Aunt Eleanor would have been proud. Now I'm curious about you, the one who stayed with me until the end of this story. What would you have done in my place? Have you ever gone through something similar? Or watched someone close to you go through it? Tell me in the comments. I read them all. And while you're here, I'm leaving 2 more of the channel's favorite stories on the final screen. Both of them have twists you won't see coming.